Hello and welcome. My name is Tom. This is the Enthusiasm Project, Season 9, Episode 8, and I can't wait, so get set, because today we are all set to talk about sets. And that was the main setup that I had for this topic. I am quite excited to talk about this because I realized I've never personally talked in depth about set design before, but it's something that I think a lot of us use and a lot of us are affected by and spend time on and maybe struggle with. And it's something I've done for a decent amount of time. And we've talked about it little bits here and there, but never really an in-depth discussion on it. And I hope that this will be super helpful. So that's kind of our main point today. Obviously, we're not talking about like film and television sets where you would normally have a crew of people that have just insane levels of skill, or even something like Saturday Night Live, where in the course of 2 days, an entire crew can build up a set that looks at the same quality as like an Academy Award winning movie or a highly acclaimed television show. We're not really talking about that. That's sort of a different level. We're talking more about the independent level, not necessarily narrative, filmmaking, because if you need to make a 1950s American living room, that's a very different type of set design than if you're making talking head YouTube videos, or you want a good background for some video calls, or you're doing a podcast, or you're doing some client work, and you just want to make sure things look good in the environment where the person is. So that's kind of more what we're talking about today, or what we will be talking about today. And of course, it's all just, everything I'm sharing is just from my own personal experience and my own opinion. So it's not the be-all, end-all correct way, one and only way. It's just what I've learned, what I've picked up, share that with you, and you can cherry pick from it what you will. And hopefully that will be helpful. And I'm really excited because I got this idea as I was going through my phone, looking at some old photos. I had found just pictures of old sets and different projects, and I found some progress photos of my YouTube studio, and I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. There's a lot that goes into this, and these are all sort of different. And I remember how so confusing things were just starting out. And, I just thought that would be a fun thing to talk about. But before that, let's talk about a little bit of gear. So today, I'm very excited to be recording with the Rode NT1 5th generation. That I finally got this last week. I've been able to do a video and a stream with it. And now this podcast, and I want to just keep using it more before I do an actual review on it. I really love the original, and I guess it's not the original, the NT1 4th generation. I was unaware that there were other generations. I thought the NT1 was the one. I guess it wasn't. But the one that I had, which has been, I think, the one that you buy for a long time, that's I've a microphone that I've loved for a long time, and it sounds really great. And the 5th generation is a little bit different. I haven't done direct sound quality comparisons. To me, this sounds really good. Definitely curious if it sounds good to you. It's supposed to be a little bit improved, maybe have a little less noise, and it kind of it sounds really, really good to me. But obviously, if you've looked into this microphone, the show-stopping feature is that it is also now a USB microphone. Rode did a really cool thing where in the XLR port is the USB jack. So there's no they don't need to take up extra space. Physically, it's not like any bigger, any different. And there's a USB-C jack right in there. And it has 32-bit float audio built in. So obviously, if you connect it to some of Rode's proprietary software, you open up a whole bunch of functionality. But even with other things like Adobe Audition, which is what I use a lot, or Logic or anything else, you can access 32-bit float audio, which essentially means that the mic is unclippable. Talked a little bit about 32-bit float audio, but it's almost like using a raw photo or raw video where even if you speak so loudly that it looks like your audio is clipped, you can go in, turn down the gain, and actually restore the clipped audio. You can declip it, paste on the tops that were cut off there of those waveforms. And that is pretty amazing. Right now, though, I'm not using it in USB. I'm using it via XLR into the Rodecaster Pro II on the Rode NT1 setting. They haven't added an NT1 5th generation, so this is just the NT1 setting. And that's what I'm using right now because it's just easy to produce the show fully Rodecastered. So that's what I'm using, and very excited to see how it works. And I'm also using, it came with an XLR cable from Rode, a red cable, which I'm hoping is an indication that they might be releasing other colored XLR cables. It's a really long cable, and it seems to be decent quality. I've been looking for long, high-quality colored audio cables I have normally on my main boom arm, I have an audio cable that was made by Alan from SoundSpeeds. It's a handmade cable, and it is so good. And it's the best audio cable I've ever used. It's crazy what a difference it makes. But it's not something I often like to use if I'm doing mic reviews and things because it's almost too good. It's like almost can give a false impression of quality sometimes because it can actually make lower quality mics sound better. And it's not something that you can I can't give you a link to go buy it. So it's like, wow, that's so cool. Cool, you can't have it. You know, sometimes every couple of years, Alan makes a batch by hand and just sort of sells them out randomly. And that's kind of it. So I like having recommendations where I can say, here, anybody can have access to this. And I'm hoping that Rode does that with these cables. So, well, we'll see, unless it sounds bad or fails or something during this recording. So in addition, the way I've tried to structure this discussion, this one-person discussion, is I've tried to organize it in that we're going to talk about set types because there is no one set type of sets. And then I want to kind of break it up, even though it is all my just personal opinion and experience, that's sort of all I have to draw off of. I wanted to break that up into things that are more concrete takeaways, like do this right now, or here is a best practice, something that will objectively work better than something else. And then also more personal style things where it's, there is no right or wrong, and it's all about what you like and what you prefer. And then I did also ask on Instagram stories if anybody had any questions about set design. And so I have quite a nice batch of questions. Some of them are things I was already going to cover, and some of them aren't. So we'll do those at the end. And I think that'll give us a nice, well-rounded discussion. So my personal experience, I guess, if you want to know, my personal experience, and then you can build off of from there, is obviously I have a studio that I make YouTube videos in, and that's kind of my main job. And I'm pretty proud of that space. That's actually the space I'm in right now. I'm proud of this space. It has grown quite a bit. It's very functional. It has some pretty cool capabilities. Obviously, it's a one-person home studio setup, so it's not going to be the same as a soundstage at a movie production studio or anything, but it's pretty great, and it's been fun to see how it's evolved over the years and what I've learned evolving it to make it more practical. So that's been my own personal thing that I've been working on now for 6 years, maybe more, and that's definitely where a lot of experience comes in. And especially a lot of the most relevant experience for anybody else who's doing anything kind of on their own or at home or in like an office space kind of thing. But I've also done client work, of course, like anyone who's into videos and some level of client work where you've had to probably do promotional videos and film interviews and that kind of thing, which even though it's not necessarily permanent, does involve levels of set design. And then I've also, through working at schools and stuff, I've built sets both for my own classes, and I've helped other schools build sets for their own stuff. And so sort of had that experience there at every level, everything from just a green screen and a camera to a full, multi-camera, like late night talk show style set. And there's a lot to learn between that. So that's kind of what I've done over maybe the past, I don't know, we'll say 12 years or so, is kind of working on those things. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I've broken this down into a few different types of sets. I'm sure there are others out there, but when I think of the ones that I see most commonly used and that I've most commonly used, I would call them stationary, modular, pop-up, and virtual. So a stationary set, think of something like The Tonight Show. The set itself can change a little bit, and they do different things, but in general, a late night talk show kind of has a very specific set in stone set, like a local news show. Like you have the news desk, you have the weather area, the sport. Bump the microphone there. Maybe a sports desk, and that's probably at a green screen, I guess. For the weather and stuff. Maybe an interview area, but it doesn't really change. It's sort of this is how it is. And I think a lot of talk shows, a lot of podcasts, a lot of things use these stationary sets where they're built and they never really change. And then maybe every few years there's a big update and a big redesign where it totally gets refreshed. A modular set is something that I would say it's modular. It's got pieces that can come in and out. I do think of Saturday Night Live a lot, where there's nothing that is specifically there. Even the main monologue area is kind of set in place where like the band is, and then a host walks down to like a stage area. But throughout the show, that stage then has a bunch of different sets built on it, taken down on it, They have stuff on the sides of that where they can wheel stuff in, move things out. In my last classroom program, I had 2 studios. One was a broadcast studio where I built a stationary set that looked like a late night talk show set. And the other one was sort of just an empty space that could be built into anything. So sometimes it would be set up for interviews. Sometimes it would be for music recording, photo shoots. I think it was a spaceship at one point. It would be, living rooms and doctors' offices. It's where more of that kind of set design would come in. And maybe that's too far in the other direction from being modular, but something along the lines of where stuff sort of can shift and change, maybe at a very basic level. If you think of like a YouTube set that involves a desk, the desk is on wheels, and so it can be moved to different places or just totally out of the way, and the person can go from sitting to standing. Something like that's a little bit modular. A pop-up set is something that I would think of more when working with clients, something that's not permanent, right? So if you get hired to make a promotional video about an organization and you go there and you need to interview people, you're not just going to like hold up a camera in whatever setting they're at and film them. You're probably going to set something up, right? You're going to find a location. You might move some furniture around, change some lighting around, make it look nice. And that's kind of what I would consider a pop-up set, because as soon as you're done filming, all that stuff's going to get taken down and then it's just going to be used for whatever it normally is. And then a virtual set, this would be, like a green screen that then gets replaced with something else. These are my least favorite. For a lot of reasons, I definitely recommend using virtual sets as a last resort, but it's very important to also recognize that sometimes they can be amazing. And we'll talk about kind of how to light a green screen and a blue screen, whatever you're doing for a virtual set. On the YouTube world, I think of like Film Riot, one of my favorite YouTube channels. I think from maybe like 2012-ish to 2015-16-ish, they primarily used virtual sets, and they did a great job. It actually fit the show and the videos really well. It was done really well. It looked really good, and that's, to me, a good example of a virtual set. I think through things like Zoom and Teams, we've all seen bad examples of virtual backgrounds where the keying is done horribly and there's static everywhere and the lighting is terrible and it's not really a convincing effect or anything. That's kind of what you want to avoid. And sometimes people think by just throwing up a green screen, now they're done. They don't have to worry about anything else. And that is kind of a dangerous place to be, because it's tough to make that look good. And yeah, so that's sort of the types of sets that we'll get into, or I guess that these concepts will apply to. And I guess now might be, since we're talking about green screen, I don't want to forget to talk about it. Let's talk about how to light a green screen. A lot of times, so my first takeaway in the next section where we talk about concrete takeaways for set design is add depth. To me, that's the number one most important thing, is don't throw someone right up against a wall or a background. You need depth often as much as possible. This also applies to green screen. I have seen so many times people want to do something on a green screen and they pull up their green screen, set it up, and then they want to just sort of lean right up against it. When I was teaching and we would have a green screen set up, we usually always had one set up because we needed it for different things. We had to put tape markers on the floor for where people should stand, because especially when teachers or students would come in for something and they're not used to working in video, their impulse would just be to stand as close to the screen as possible. And it's like, no. I would put them like a meter, probably 2 meters away from the green screen. So 6 feet away from the green screen, at least, is usually where I would put them. Because when you're doing a green screen, you don't really need the whole frame to be filled with green. So if you're working with a smaller green screen, at one point I had one that was like 25 feet wide and 15 feet tall or something. It was a huge green screen, so that it filled the frame no matter what. But a lot of home green screens, like the Elgato one or something, it can kind of be hard to get them to, they can almost be smaller than your camera lens's field of view. But it doesn't matter as long as your subject is surrounded by green. That's all you're looking for. It doesn't matter if you can see the edge of the screen and the background or whatever. As long as the subject, and when it moves or when the person moves, they don't go beyond the edge of the green, they're surrounded by green, you're fine. Because then in your software, you just crop that out and it doesn't matter. You're not going to see the other stuff anyway. So adding in depth is really important, because what you don't want are shadows on the green screen. And when you stand really close to it, or this applies to a blue screen or anything, but when you stand really close to it, it's easier to cast shadows. And then the shadows make it very difficult to get a good key, especially if somebody has a lot of hair and there's all these fine details to sort of key out. The shadow is going to make that almost impossible. If you put depth between the person and the green screen, there's going to be less shadows, which makes it easier to get a good key. It also makes it easier to do correct lighting. One of the most important things when it comes to working with a green screen is to realize that if you want to do it as good as possible, you're really lighting two different things independently. You're lighting the subject and the green screen, and they're not the same necessarily. When you're lighting the screen, what you want is as kind of bright and even as possible. So oftentimes what I would use is like a couple of softboxes, maybe even mount a light overhead, whatever I could do to make the screen as evenly lit as possible. We didn't want really bright hot spots, dark shadows. I love the Elgato like pop-up green screen. Heather has one because it's so easy to use and it's like perfectly even every time. But a lot of people end up working with like sheets and fabric for green screens. And so setting those up, I went to Home Depot and just spent like $50 buying like 50 of those strong little workshop clamps. And so even if I'm just using like a lighting stand or something, or multiple stands to mount green screens or even curtain rods or something pretty basic and budget friendly, taking those clamps and really like stretching the fabric to be taut. I had to make sure that my students were taught to do that. That really helped eliminate stuff, even though there could still be some wrinkles, and then you could kind of eliminate the other shadows with the lighting. And so the green screen is set up and lit perfectly, and then you pull the person out where they're not being affected by those lights. And then you set up different lights for them for whatever you want. Maybe it's a standard 3-point lighting setup. Maybe you're doing something more dramatic or more stylized, or whatever you're doing, it doesn't really matter. You can even use gelled lights, different colored lights, be as stylistically creative as you want. It's not going to matter because the green screen behind them is lit separately. So it's always going to be bright, evenly green. They can be whatever you need them to be. And then when you go in to key that out in your software, it's going to be so much easier to get a better looking key, which is key to a better looking green screen. So some of the basic thing to remember there is if you're working with a green screen, not only to add depth, but to remember that you're lighting two different things. You're lighting the screen and you're lighting the subject. That does kind of apply to physical sets as well, because you're usually not just using one light for everything. You probably have lights for your subject, and then you probably have set lights, studio lights, accent lights for the background. So let's talk about that. Let's move into some of those concrete takeaways, which are still, admittedly somewhat subjective, but concrete things that you can do or incorporate into set design. As I just mentioned, my number one recommendation, if you take nothing else away from this episode or you just stop listening after this, if you're designing a set, if you're setting anything up anywhere where you're filming someone, add depth. Put depth between the subject and the background. That is my number one recommendation, even if you don't need or want a super shallow depth of field. So a big reason to add depth is to be able to get background blur. That is because if the subject is next to the background, even if you have a lens with a really shallow depth of field, it's all going to be one thing because the person's on the background. So if you move them away from the background, now the camera and the lens can focus on them. The background can be out of focus and a little bit blurry. But even if you don't want that, just adding depth, you probably want a little bit of background blur. It's rare that you want everything in a set to be perfectly in focus from the very front to the very back. But either way, just adding that depth also makes it look like the person hasn't just been thrown up against a wall or up against some shelves. And that always looks uncomfortable. There were so many times where working with students on some of their first projects, when they would do interviews, they would just find a wall and everything would just be, look, it's a person thrown up against a brown stucco wall. What an amazing interview. And it's like, we can get into not using just a brown stucco wall as a background, but also having the person up against, it literally looks like you take someone and you shove them up against the wall and now you're forcing them to be interviewed. And it's this really uncomfortable kind of claustrophobic feel that can develop when you have someone right up against their background. So not only technically does it look bad because it can cause problems with lighting and shadows and all this unpleasant stuff, but it just looks uncomfortable. It looks like somebody is cramped and like just smashed up against something. So the more depth that you can create, the better, regardless of how much of your background you do or do not want to be in focus. And a big way that that depth comes into play is my next point, which is controlling your light. If you're on a budget, if your budget is light, you might just need to use the sun, right? The original video light. Use the sun. But for now, we can't control the sun. It does what it does, right? Or I guess the earth does what it does. The sun does not stay stationary. Weather does not stay stationary. And so you're kind of at the mercy of the earth and weather and physics when you're using the sun. It doesn't even mean if you're going outside. A big window is a great resource for good lighting, especially because windows oftentimes, just because the way the sun, if it's not shining directly into a window, it's probably bouncing off of a wall or a ground or something, and that's diffusing it a little bit. And so you're getting a little bit more even light. And so sometimes just filming next to a window, not necessarily like where you're facing the window and it's just this bright light in front of you, but if you angle yourself so the window's sort of almost like a key light, like a 45-degree angle kind of off to the side, you can get some really good looking stuff. But because the light will change, if you film for a long time, you're going to notice lighting changes. You're going to notice weather changes. If the sun's not out because it's nighttime, what are you going to do? My goal when designing a set, especially something that's going to be more permanent, is to make sure that no matter what time of day you film there, it looks the same. So in my home YouTube studio, if I film at 7 in the morning, noon, or midnight, it's going to look exactly the same. No one would ever know what time it is. There's no indication of the outside world in there bringing in light or anything. And that's really important for just creating that consistency, not just stylistically so that everything you make looks the same, but it does also make it easy to refilm things, reshoot stuff later, mix and match footage from different days. It makes it so much easier to keep your equipment set up because your cameras and your lights, everything that you're using is sort of set to this one environment. And now you don't have to keep changing it and adjusting it every time. You're also not worried about taking too long because the weather's changing. Oh my gosh, now my light's disappearing. And that's never a fun situation to find yourself. It will happen from time to time where you're sort of, fighting daylight or losing daylight, as they say. And that's fine. But if you don't have to do that, if you can control things where you're not in that situation, I think that's definitely the way to go. So controlling the light as much as possible. You might have to start out using windows or the sun, but if you don't want to be at the mercy of the Earth's rotation and weather, invest in some video lights, even just real basic, like the $100 light kits that you can find on Amazon or wherever are going to be a huge step up from no dedicated studio lights. So get some basic lights, figure out how to place them in a way that looks good, and then that's going to level things up tremendously. And then in addition to adding depth and controlling your light, very important to make your set practical for the purpose. Sometimes people can get carried away in just making something that looks pretty, but it ends up being pretty impractical. And what I mean by that is if you are building something, say it's a podcast set, where there's going to be 3 to 4 people every episode recording a podcast, but you've designed everything in a way that's really tight and confining that it's like impossible for people to enter and exit. Or maybe you're somebody who, if you're 5'1" and 100 pounds and you have designed a set that you have no problem maneuvering in, but then you realize some of the other people using the set are 6'4" and 300 pounds, and now they can't literally fit into the set, that can be a problem. And I know that sounds silly, but it's something that happens all the time. Make sure that there is plenty of room where people can comfortably exist within that space as they need to. If you're the only person using it, it's your own personal home studio setup, obviously it's all to your preference and your, whatever you need. It's kind of how my room is set up. Every once in a while, someone else will be in here with me, filming something or whatever it might be. And it's honestly oftentimes kind of uncomfortable for them. And I feel bad for them in the time that we're doing that because it's really not set up for not only anybody else, but just really a second person in general. But for 95% of the stuff I'm doing, it's just me. So I'm much more concerned for it being set up for me than for everyone else. If everything I did involved other people, then I would have to design this space differently. So making it practical for the purpose is really important. Adding in room for your equipment. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen people put together these beautiful looking sets, and then when it comes time to like, well, where are you going to put cameras? Where are you going to put lights? Where are you going to put audio gear? They actually don't have anywhere to put their audio gear. One thing that I did, the room that is my YouTube studio prior to doing YouTube was just sort of my like home office. And some elements were the same. Like there was a big blue wall with pictures on it and stuff. And I loved that. But my office was set with me facing the blue wall because it looks cool. And when I'm in here working on stuff, I wanted to see the cool blue wall with all the cool stuff on it. Like that was entertaining. But that meant that if I was filming a video and I put the camera where I was facing it, in the background was not anything very interesting. And so when I wanted to dedicate this space primarily for video production, one of the first things I did was try to pretend the space was empty, forget all the stuff in here, take the camera and just move the camera into different locations until I sort of found what looks best, what gave me the most depth, what looked best on camera. And then I like literally put the camera in that spot and rearranged and built everything around that. And I think that's a smart thing to do, because then you not only have room for your equipment, but you have chosen what's going to be, the best angle and stuff like that. It's also important to consider when you're designing a set for specific purposes, what you're going to be using it for. A big thing that comes to mind in the world of YouTube is top-down shots, where, someone has an overhead camera and they film things from above. I do those sometimes. I do those infrequently enough that I don't want to have it permanently set up. So when I need to do a top-down shot, I usually grab a C-stand, mount a camera on it, and it's kind of a pain. Like, if I had something permanently set up, I would honestly probably do more top-down shots, but I don't need them that often, and it is kind of a pain to set up, but it is what it is. I do know people who use them in almost every video. And if I had to do that every time I wanted to make a video, if I had to set up that whole thing, it'd be such a nightmare. So, if you're somebody, for example, who's going to do top-down shots in almost every video you make, having a permanent top-down setup, whether that's, a camera mounted above your main desk, or even, I know a lot of people, because they do top-down shots for like B-roll and product images, they will have a totally separate area, like a separate desk with its own lighting and its own camera mount, where it's always ready to go as like the top-down setup. They never have to reset anything up. That kind of stuff is really important. And if you're making a lot of videos and you're constantly working on stuff, it will save you so much time as time goes on. And that ties into my next point, which is designing your set in a way where you can leave as much gear in place as possible. So this isn't even the stuff you see on camera, the pretty decorations and the walls and the designs, but the actual equipment. If you have to unpack your lights, unpack your camera gear, set up your tripod every time, it's a pain. You're not going to want to do it. It's very easy to be lazy. If you can minimize that as much as possible, I haven't gotten quite to this point. I can keep my camera, my light set up pretty consistently, and that's nice. It's also, when you have multiple cameras, it's nice because I can still use cameras without having to disassemble a main studio camera. But I still have quite a few switches that have to be flipped. And, there are some things it's like I gotta crawl under the desk and hit this button to turn on, there's things like that aren't super convenient. I've tried to eliminate as many switches as possible. I've tried to put things on remote controls so I can access difficult to reach switches and power, pretty easily. But I've known people who've been able to set up their space where it's like 1 or 2 light switches on the wall. They walk in, they push those, and it just springs to life. I was able to do that with the broadcast set that I built at the last school that I taught at, where it really was only a couple of switches, and the whole thing just like sprung to life and just looked amazing. So you could go from pitch black to ready to broadcast in a few seconds, which was pretty amazing and pretty awesome. And yeah, I can't do that quite at home. But the more that you can do that, the better. The more that you can leave equipment in place, the better. And when you're setting this up, when you're setting up where your equipment's going to go and the location that you're using, trying to keep in mind multiple angles is really helpful too. Not just filming with multiple cameras, like maybe you have an A camera and a B camera, but can you use different things? Like in my YouTube room, I can have a head-on shot where it's It's all very symmetrical. The desk is at the bottom. I'm facing the camera right in the middle. You can see the back wall. You can see some of the side walls, and there's like even spacing on those. It's a very symmetrical shot. But then I can also pan the camera a little bit to the right and shoot into one corner of the room. I can pan the camera left, shoot into the other corner, and I can even move the camera more to like 90 degrees off to my side and film facing like an entirely different wall, or it's kind of like my desk set up there. So that's kind of like 4 different angles to shoot in one relatively small space. So the more that you can create a space where it's almost like anywhere you point a camera is a good angle to shoot, the better. Not just like, I think there was a comic that came out when people were doing a lot of like remote work during the pandemic, but it was like the cone of cleanliness, where it was somebody at their computer and they were sitting there dressed very nicely, and their background had like a nice shelf with a little plant. And then outside of the camera's field of view was just like a hoarder's nest of like clothes and dishes and all this junk everywhere. But whatever the camera saw was perfect. That's something that happens in a lot of studios and a lot of set design. But I think the more that you can avoid that, the better, just for your own sanity, but also knowing that you can move the camera in more places. One thing I had to do in here was there's a window in this room, and I always hated how the window looked on camera. So if I knew that if I had the camera in some locations and I moved it just a little bit too far, like I panned it a little too far, I would start to see the blinds in the window. And I tried to put on different curtains and all this stuff, and it drove me crazy. And finally, I was like, look, I never use this window. As far as I'm concerned, this could just be a wall. I'm not going to take out the window, but it could be. So instead, that's where I got some of the colored rolled down paper, and I mounted the paper rollers so that I have backgrounds that the window's entirely blocked out by different colored background paper. And it made that space more usable because it's perfect for product photography. Now, it's a little bit in the corner and kind of out of the way, but it's easy to set up lights. It's easy to get good backdrops. It's easy to, film a lot of product photos, a lot of thumbnail photos and stuff right in that space. So now instead of having, a huge chunk of my area that I'm trying to avoid on camera, it looks great on camera, and it even serves a specific purpose where it can even be the primary focus sometimes. So that works, like taking advantage of those multiple angles is very important. Another very important thing to be aware of, though, concrete takeaway, wherever you're setting up your set, be aware of whatever electrical limits might be in place. It's not uncommon for people to plug in a lot of audio production gear, something I've certainly never done, and blow a circuit breaker or short something out. Fortunately, it's a lot more difficult to do than it used to be, especially if you're working in a somewhat modern building. If you're working in a 150-year-old historical site, it might be different. But if you're working in a house or an office that was built in the last 10 or 20 years, it probably has decent electrical. And because so much lighting and stuff is all LED now, it takes so much less power and generates so much less heat than it used to, that you can probably handle more lighting. But being aware of, you don't want to just plug, I can't think of what those things are called. The thingy with all the plugs in it, not an extension cable, but, I can't think, a power strip. Yeah, whatever. A surge protector, a power strip, whatever. You don't want to just plug that into one outlet and load it with, 15 lights and monitors and stuff, and then turn it on and just put that huge power stress on that one outlet. So wherever your environment is, understanding the power limitations and being safe and practical with that is very important. I always get asked whenever I do studio tour videos, like, your electrical bill must be crazy because you have all these lights in there. It's like, no, it makes literally no difference to the overall power bill. It's compared to like running a heater or an air conditioner or something. I'm sure it changes it by a few dollars, but no, they're all LED lights. They don't take any power. They're, I know there are very powerful LED lights out there. I'm not using those insanely powerful ones in here. So no, it doesn't make any difference, but it totally can. I remember the days of using like halogen bulbs and real tungsten bulbs that would get very, very hot, generate a lot of power, have a very real risk of electrocuting you or burning you, break very easily, and generate so much heat. When I first, the studio that I built the broadcast set in, so it was a new building that had been built, and there was a room that was built for a broadcast studio. So it was about, I think it's 20 feet by 20 feet. It was a pretty decent space. And then it also had a separate control room. So there was, glass windows and then a very long, narrow control room where you could put monitors and switchers and stuff. And there's a video, I have a video about how I built the whole thing on my channel, so I don't need to go into all the details here. It's an old video, so don't judge me on it, but I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to see the space that I'm talking about. And it evolved over time too. But when I first built it, I spent an entire 2-month like summer vacation just building this from scratch, and it came out great. It's one of the things I'm still most proud of that I've done. It was awesome, and we used it for years. It's still being used now, but I think it's sort of been like, last I saw, it had kind of, I don't know if not taken care of is the word, but it's not in the same way that I would have kept it or did keep it. But it's still being used, and it's been now like 6 years. But when they built that studio space, the school had a big theater, and it was like having a really nice big theater was important. So they put a lot of money into the theater. And then they built these other studios that were for video, the 2 that were in my like classroom space. And for some reason, they decided to put theater lights in them. So they were these orange, super hot tungsten lights that took so much power and generated so much heat. And then when you have students, high school students, many of whom are wearing a lot of makeup, and now they're sitting under lights for an hour practicing or doing a broadcast, they kind of start melting, like their faces start melting off. And it's very uncomfortable. Plus, we are in the desert where it can easily be way over 100 degrees, 110 degrees. And now you're in this super hot space. Like, people were dying. And so one of the things I did not long after building the set was just take out those lights and just mount LED lights, which I feel did give a better quality of light. And then also took way less power, so they were safer to use. And they also generated like no heat. So the lights could be on there all day, even though I had tons of them. They didn't generate any heat. And then I was able to run those lights into a DMX panel so they could be controlled. You didn't have to like climb on a ladder and turn on each light or anything. You could just control them from the control room, turn individual lights on and off or groups of lights on and off. That was really cool. That's a little more advanced setting up something like that. But point being aware of the power that your equipment's going to take from your space and working within those limits, very important. Kind of ties into the next thing. You've got all this gear, you've got this set, you want it to look nice, you want it to be practical, you want it to be safe. Hiding and managing cables is huge. Like, some of the things that I have learned that I've done at home and I've done in other, like schools and stuff, they make these little things, they're like cable wall manager things. It's like a little plastic U-shaped thing, and then it has a nail on it. And you can just put the U part around a cable and then nail it into the wall. If you've ever seen like a Casey Neistat video where he tours his studio, you see like patterns. The cables are like tied in patterns on the wall, and they're all very intricate looking. He's using a ton of these things. You can get bags of like 200 of them for $10 or something. And they're great. So if you need to run cables along the bottom of walls or up, corners or something, they work amazing. They're super cheap, super easy, and I definitely recommend that. Other things that are very helpful, something I would do when I had cameras that were set in specific spaces is you can buy, I forget exactly what it's called, but they're almost like Velcro sleeves. And, so for example, in that broadcast studio, there were 3 permanent cameras. Each camera had a teleprompter on it. And so the cameras had power running to them, all of the prompter cables, they had, and then the video output and input cables to send their signals. And then sometimes you'd have like tally light cables. So there's a lot of cables going to each camera. And then there's 3 of those permanent cameras, and they were on wheeled dolly tripods. So cables are getting run over. And you can buy these things, they're like kind of Velcro sleeves. And so I would take all the cables, make sure they were good quality cables in good condition, because it's a complete pain to change this. And I would zip tie or Velcro them together, so that way it was a nice like thick braid of a cable. And then you would take this sort of cover thing, and it's like a Velcro sheath that kind of goes around it. And that way people could step on it and it wouldn't hurt anything. It was too big to get caught in the wheels of the dollies of the cameras. And it also just kept things really neat and organized. Absolutely a pain if you ever needed to swap out a cable, but it was a huge boost to like safety and organization. I don't have anything like that in my home studio because I don't really need it, but cable management is huge. Not having cables all over the floor, which just causes all kinds of problems. Big deal with set design. I have noticed a lot of times people, especially on YouTube, they will create a pretty wall or something in the background, but their camera will be at an angle where you can see their floor, and their floor just has like power cables and video cables everywhere, and it's like, what are you doing? This looks terrible. Something I recommend doing when you're thinking of designing a set is taking lots and lots of photos of other things everywhere. If you go through my phone, you'll find like pictures of murals, pictures of walls, not just because they're pretty, but because I like the colors, I like the design. If I go to a furniture store and I see a cool desk or a chair, take photos of that. And it all just sort of, it's almost like like an idea board where it's just sort of things that you keep in mind. If I know of TV shows or YouTube channels that have sets that I like, I might take a screenshot or something so that I can just sort of remember what I like. And we'll talk about why that's important, but that's a really helpful thing when it comes to coming up with ideas, is taking inspiration from sort of everywhere. And you never know when those ideas might end up being useful as time goes on. As you're putting things together, keeping durability in mind is really important. So when I was designing a studio for a school, durability was really important. And unfortunately, most schools are working with razor thin budgets, so you can't just afford the highest quality everything all the time. And so there was a very like delicate line to walk there. But I knew this stuff needs to last for many years, and it's going to be used not just by many people, hundreds and hundreds of students, but teenagers, people who maybe aren't by nature the most careful with all of this stuff. And, a lot of them will learn to do that over time, but you kind of need to, I think the term is hufter proof. You need to design things in a way where you know that they're going to be messed with and used inappropriately, and try to like design it and put it together with that in mind. Durability is very, very important. That being said, if you're just setting stuff up at home for yourself and no one else to use, you also probably don't need the same thing that a Hollywood soundstage is going to use. If you got the money for it and the space for it, fine. But sometimes those big, durable, professional things can be, really big and really heavy and really expensive, and you probably don't need it. There have been plenty of times where little adapters and cables and bits and pieces, even, like I'm looking at a camera monitor right now that's mounted on a pole in my studio. It's not an expense. I just needed something to see the camera signal. I didn't need the clearest image. I didn't need all the features. I just needed to be able to see a camera that was mounted not near me when I'm sitting at this space. So I could get the cheapest thing possible. Sometimes getting the cheap stuff, the very consumer grade things, is totally fine and can work great. And other times it causes a lot of problems. So every time that you're getting something for your studio or your set, I think it's important to consider, where on that durability spectrum does it need to lie? And I think you'd be surprised. I love getting the heavy duty, like pro stuff whenever possible, but I think you might be surprised at how often the less expensive, just sort of like basic budget consumer stuff can actually get the job done, especially if not a lot of people are going to be using it. If it's just you or you and one other person, just don't be abusive to the stuff. However, regardless of the quality that you get, the last concrete takeaway is to buy extras as often as possible. If you're buying a cable, buy 2 cables. If you're buying an adapter, buy 5 adapters. Like any time that you can have extras of things is very important, because stuff does fail. Even if you treat it well, things sometimes just fail and go bad for any number of reasons. And when you need to do something, it's not just a for funsies thing, but you have to do something. You're scheduled to do something, or it's not a home studio, it's a professional setup that needs to be used for clients, and something breaks, being able to just pull out a spare and replace it, huge. Same way you wouldn't leave, you're not going to go on a big photo shoot with one camera battery that's halfway charged. You're going to take multiple fully charged batteries. You're going to have spares. Same exact thing. So let's move on now from concrete takeaways like that, which are pretty just practical things when it comes to putting a set together, to less concrete things and things that I think are more about personal style. So we'll say that you've got your equipment figured out, you've got your space selected, and now you're actually trying to build your set and you're trying to design it. This is kind of Well, it's all the fun part, but this is really fun. Like what's it actually going to look like? How much is within your control? How much is not? Something to keep in mind is that everything in a frame on screen says something. Not like a picture in a frame, but in the frame of the camera says something. Sometimes a blank wall is better than something that says the wrong thing. So, I'm one to talk because my main background is it looks like a Chili's or whatever, like a Fuddruckers restaurant where there's just like a bunch of crazy crap on the walls and a bunch of words everywhere and colors and designs. I like that look. It's also one of the reasons I try to blur out the background so you're not totally distracted by the words all the time. But everything does say something. And and sometimes I remember a friend showed me a picture of their kid. They went up to like eat ice cream at like a local kind of gourmet ice cream place. And it was a very cute picture of like a 4-year-old girl eating an ice cream cone, happy as could be. And that was the picture they were showing me. They weren't intending to show me anything else. But what I noticed before anything was that right behind her in the window of the restaurant was a giant bright red arrow pointing to her that just said donkey balls. And that was the name of some weird thing they had on the menu. I don't know. I still don't know what they were at the ice cream shop. I didn't want to ask. But it was funny, like the person taking the photo genuinely didn't notice that, but it was the only thing I could see, and it was pointing to like the child in the photo. That would not be great set design because the main thing you're trying to communicate is completely getting lost. It's, a very simple version would be when someone wears a distracting shirt on camera. If there's a big slogan on it or like something crazy offensive or distracting, it's going to be hard for people to listen to what you're saying because they're just reading your shirt the whole time or they're just focusing on that. Your set and your studio and your background are kind of the same. And so sometimes literally nothing is better than something. Just having that blank wall, as long as you're not up against it and you have some depth between it, that can sometimes be way more effective. Put a light somewhere on the floor, like splashing up on the wall, add some color or something. Totally fine. Get some of that roll down backdrop paper, have a colored backdrop. Cool. Sometimes a very simple, very basic background is all that you need. It's not always my favorite set design. I've seen it look really well, really good, and people do it really well. But there was a trend on YouTube maybe like 2 years ago where it seemed like every channel, especially in the tech space, was someone at a desk, front on, head on shot with the camera and just colored I think it was just colored roll down backdrop paper behind them. A lot of it was gray. There maybe were some blues. It really looked to me like 15 different channels were just using the same set. And I always imagined a line of people off to the side, like someone sitting down with their stack of smartphones and making a video, and then they get up and leave, and the next person comes in and sits down with like their stack of smartphones and makes a video, because it all ended up looking kind of the same. That's something I think you want to avoid. And I'm glad that trend died out a little bit. It wasn't that the set design was bad. It's that it was so simple and it did work so well that then everybody started doing it. And it started like eliminating the personality part of it, because that's what you should probably want, especially if you're an independent creator creating a set, is you want that, like, you want your personality to shine through. So that leads into my next point, which is about avoiding trends. I mean, we've all seen YouTube is the perfect place. You can just like go year through year in different niches and see the different trends. And the photo video space is huge on that because everyone in it is interested in photo video. So they want to constantly try new things, and they see this person's doing that, I'm going to try that. And then, times 50, and now everybody's stuff looks exactly the same. Sometimes trends are good, right? Like sometimes, I know it was a cliche, maybe it's less now, but a couple years ago it was like, oh, everyone just has a Sony a7S III. That's just the trendy camera. It's like, well, it was just like a really practical, good camera for a lot of people to use. So maybe it was a trend, but it also like did a good job and served people really well. There are other trends where, somebody takes time building a studio setup that looks great and works for them, and then somebody else just wants to copy paste that to them, but they don't have the organic connection to that. It doesn't fit as well. And then it's like the thing where it's a copy of a copy of a copy, and each one kind of gets a little more watered down. So Always do what you like. If you see something, regardless of if it's trendy or not, and you love it, embrace it, go for it. But definitely, I think, be aware when you're like, this is something I have seen in many, many different channels or in many different things. Maybe it's not something I necessarily want. A really weird example, actually, where I can tie it to maybe, and I could be wrong in this, but Luke Miani, who is like an Apple tech channel. Several years ago, he was building a new set, and it was kind of cool. He had rented a part. This is not bad on Luke, actually. I'm blaming him for something, but he's the one I think did it first. He rented an apartment that was just to be a set, which I know is something I think Gerald and Dunn has done that too. I think his studio is just an apartment that nobody lives in. It's just the studio. Luke was doing that. He was building a set, and he wanted to create kind of what I was talking about, where it's a table and a plain background, but instead of just being a solid color, he wanted some texture. And he found these panels. They're like 1 or 2 foot by 1 or 2 foot panels that sort of had like this geometric texture on them. And so he ordered 50 of them, and was able to basically panel an entire wall. And since he was just renting the studio space, this was great because they didn't damage the wall or anything. He was able to like easily mount them on. They're super lightweight. They were lightly colored, so they took light really well. They created these really cool shadows, and it actually looked awesome. I thought it was a brilliant idea and a pretty budget-friendly idea. I hadn't seen it done before anywhere else. Well, after I saw that, I still see this done all the time. I see these exact same panels because they have a very specific pattern, and each one is exactly the same. So I see this same thing done constantly, and now it's to the point where it's like it's distracting. Even so much so, and if I were Luke, I would want to take credit for this, but there was an episode, I think it was in the last season of Better Call Saul, where it was if you watch Better Call Saul, it was in Nacho's apartment, which is supposed to be like, he's like a drug dealer guy, but he has a lot of money. Well, I guess because, it's a very like, I don't, not high end, but he's got a lot of fancy stuff, and there's like fancy artwork everywhere. And a bunch of the artwork around the apartment were just these exact same panels painted gray, but it was like this texture. And I was like, one, this is supposed to take place in 2004. And I know for a fact those panels were not available before 2019. But also, like, did they get the idea from Tech YouTube? Like, is that where this came from? And I kind of think it might have, because I didn't see that anywhere else before then. And then it became so popular, and then it trickled over into mainstream television. It looks great. It doesn't look bad. And, the person who not designed it, but the person who sort of like took the time to come up with it and figure it out, obviously did something they should be proud of, because people loved it so much. They also wanted to try to do it. There's nothing wrong necessarily with that, but being aware that, especially if something does become trademarked, if there's a channel that's big and has a large audience, like Luke's channel, I think he's at close to 500,000 subscribers. His videos get significant numbers of views. So there's a pretty large audience there. If you're doing something that a large channel is doing, and you just sort of take it and do it yourself, it's going to be really hard for people who stumble across that not to forget about you and think that you're just copying this other person. And sometimes that happens on accident, right? Like you stumble across something on your own and do it, and then it's like, oh wait, this is already something that somebody else has popularized. I didn't know that. That's okay. I mean, even if you want to just copy and paste something someone else does, if that's what you really want to do, go for it. But being aware of trends and when to embrace them, when to avoid them, is definitely a very, very important thing. And that ties into whether it's YouTube or television, movies, whatever. Kind of how I said earlier, to take a lot of photos, really paying attention to what you do and don't like in different sets. So I talked about the Tonight Show earlier. I do not like the Tonight Show set, the Jimmy Fallon set. There's something about it. I think it's the colors that I really dislike. I don't like the color of the desk and the background. Everything's kind of got like this weird muted. I don't like it. I find it like kind of unpleasant to look at, and everything looks sort of cheap and fake. That's my opinion. But it's really important to be aware of that. because if I wanted to build a set like that, it would be important to know what colors to avoid, what styles to avoid. The opposite end of that, Conan O'Brien, I got to be, when Conan was hosting The Tonight Show very briefly, I jinxed it. It's all my fault that he's not anymore, because I got to be in the very front row of the very first episode of Conan's Tonight Show. So when he was giving like the monologue on his very first episode as host of The Tonight Show, he was basically just staring at like me and three friends. It was so cool. It was the coolest thing. And that set, like the Tonight Show set, where NBC had moved it from New York to LA, or back to LA, I guess, built an entirely new soundstage for it. It was huge. A lot of times when you walk into TV studio sets or whatever, you're kind of struck by how small they seem in real life. And this set was massive. And it had like all these really cool areas. It was amazing, like Art Deco style. It's still, I would still put it as like my favorite late night talk show set, or maybe just even one of my favorite television sets ever. And I remember sitting there in that front row thinking, I can't believe I'm here. This set is amazing. I was thinking of all the incredible stuff that, you know, there's so many things that's going to happen here over the years. I can't believe I get to be here on the first night. And now years and years from now, I can always think that I was there when that began, when all of this, you know, amazing stuff happens in this space. And then the show ended 6 months later. So I think I jinxed it, and I apologize for that. But it was interesting because then Conan went from NBC and The Tonight Show to TBS and The Conan Show, and the budget changed a lot. And especially when he started with the Conan set, which I got to see him several times there too, it was much, much smaller. And it ended up still being a pretty nice set, but it did not have the same feel. And I eventually liked it, but I would rate it like a 7 or an 8 out of 10, whereas the Tonight Show set for him was, to me, like a 10 out of 10, which is funny though, because the set I like the least is also the Tonight Show set. It's Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show set. I don't like that at all. So that kind of stuff's really important. I realized, not that I can really incorporate this much into my YouTube studio, but when I was building the broadcast set, my students and I were looking up just all kinds of set design pictures. And one thing we noticed that we all liked were shiny surfaces, which are probably not the best thing to have in a studio, but especially if you watch a lot of news and stuff, the desks are shiny, the floor is shiny, the walls are shiny. Like, there's so much shiny things, and the reason I like that is it adds like texture. It almost looks like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, like in the J.J. Abrams movies where everything's lens flary and cuckoo, which I actually really like that look. So finding what you like, it's not necessarily stealing those ideas. It's not like, oh, well, they're using a black glass desk, so I will get a black glass desk, but it's going like, oh, shiny surfaces are cool. The way that this lighting works is cool. The way that, you know, the desk is positioned in relation to this background element is cool. Like figuring out that stuff, whether it's YouTube, traditional broadcast or something, and kind of keeping a catalog of all those things you like is really, really important. And if you're somebody, we're talking a lot about building a set, but if you're somebody who does a lot of client work, where you're doing, we talked about like quote unquote pop-up sets. If you're doing a lot of that work, you can take a lot of these ideas into the field with you. You know, you're filming a wedding, you're doing it. You can still take the principles of, you know, lighting and composition and background elements and use those, even though you're not creating a permanent set. It's been a while since I've done this, because I haven't done like a lot of client work lately by choice. But one of the last things I did, Heather and I actually worked with a nonprofit to do a promotional piece for them, like about what they do. And the nonprofit was a place for victims of abuse, basically to provide shelter for victims of abuse, and then to help them either start legal proceedings against the abuser or to relocate, not anonymously. It wasn't like the witness protection program, but if they needed to get, you know, out of state, to help them do that without getting on anybody's radar, so they could get away safely and securely and, you know, go to a safe place. So that was the organization we were creating a promotional thing for. It involved pretty standard stuff, some interviews, some B-roll footage, you know, all that. when we were getting there, we needed to do 2 more interviews that day. One of them was with one of the directors of the program, and one of them was with one of the clients from the program. So the client, because this is a place for victims of abuse, the client, even though she was somebody who was doing really well now and had gotten a lot out of being there, which is why she was willing to be in the video, didn't want to show her face. Very understandably. You don't go to a place like this, which is super anonymous, and then be like, yeah, put me in 3-point lighting, 4K resolution, like, yeah, with my name on screen. So her interview, it was really important to have firsthand telling of what the services they provided. But her interview was going to be the silhouette interview, where we're also like disguising the voice a bit to protect the person's identity. And there's no, there's a fake name on screen. It's not like her name or whatever, the name's in quotes kind of thing. I'm sure you've seen it a million times. So that was that interview. And the other interview was with one of the program directors, who, of course, is like, yeah, I'm on camera. You want to see my face? I'm the person you're going to talk to when you come in here. Like, I want to be here. Donors, like, I'm the person that the donors are going to want to talk to, that kind of thing. And we were filming her interview in sort of like this library reading room kind of thing. And I remember we were walking by and kind of looking at the rooms. We were supposed to film the client interview first and the director's interview second. And looking in the room where we were supposed to film hers, it was just like the time of day, the lighting was starting to come through the windows in like this perfect, it was going to create like amazing golden hour light indoors. And the room was painted like these really nice colors. So it was going to really start bringing those colors out. And everything was just looking perfect in that. Like, you couldn't have just set it up better. But because a lot of that, even though we had lights and things, a lot of that background element, that atmospheric look was related to the sun, it was pretty limited on time. The other thing we were filming was in a dark room with one light that was creating a silhouette over someone. It's something we could have filmed at any time of day or night, and it would look exactly the same. And so, keeping some of these principles of like set design, background design, if we had kept to our original schedule, we would have ended up filming the director in the really nice looking space after the sun had gone down. And that meant she would actually be in kind of like a dark, we could have lit it and made it look pretty, but you would have been able to tell it was dark outside, which creates a certain mood. So we asked if we could flip those interviews and film that one first with this amazing lighting. And it was one where when we were editing the thing, we had to like work to take more of her stuff out because it just looked so good that it's like, I want to use more of this interview, but it wasn't serving the overall purpose, but it looked so amazing. And then we went and did the client interview afterwards. Fortunately, we could do that. You can't always, people's schedules don't always let that happen. But in this case, we were able to do that. But the lesson learned in something like that is really being aware of those things and taking advantage of what you can take advantage of when you can take advantage of it. And, being prepared to kind of adapt so that you end up with the best looking stuff possible. Ultimately, I remember that was a thing, kind of an argument I used to get into when I started teaching digital media, and I started teaching a lot about equipment, and there was kind of like this outside consultant, a lot of stories about this, but a retired industry professional, I guess we'll say, who was just all about like, it's just story. Kids don't need to learn about equipment. And my argument was like, well, this is a career technical education program. I know they're not all going to be like, movie directors or something, but I do want them to at least have some experience using professional and semi-professional equipment by the time they graduate so that they can create client projects. They can get into, higher education programs. They could go further with this if they want to. And his argument was like, no, it doesn't matter. And keep in mind, this is, before phones were as good as they are or anything. So it's like some of the footage that he would want to like submit to festivals was awful. And my argument was, yes, having a purpose, having a story is very important. But if your story is that good and you have the ability to make it look and sound even better, don't you owe it to that really good story and that really good purpose to make it look and sound as good as possible? I think that the answer is yes. And that's why set design and all that stuff becomes really important. So we're going long here, but that's okay. There's a lot to talk about. I feel like there's even more. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure to go through some of the Instagram questions that I've got. So thank you to everyone who replied to those. That was cool. First one is from Dave Clausen, who asks, wall color tip. My set feels boring. I have decor and LED color lights though. So you're asking for a good wall color. It kind of depends on what you're going for. So if you're wanting to use LED lights, obviously a white wall or a gray wall, you could get very technical and do like 18% gray. So that way it's like the perfect video production gray. Those are colors that will really take colored lighting well. So you can have a gray wall, but then you can throw RGB lights on it to make it any color you want. And a lot of people do that for the versatility. And that's a cool thing. I've talked about background wallpaper. I mean, you can do background cloth. The paper is nice because if it gets messed up, you just tear off the broken part and pull down more, and it's relatively affordable, and it's very easy to change out colors. So like I just went with not CMY, CMY, cyan, magenta, and yellow are what are on my rollers right now, because they're just the primary like print colors, but I like them. And that's an easy thing to do. In my own home studio, the back wall is blue, and that's just because that's the color I painted it when I moved into this space way before YouTube, and I'm happy that it looks good on camera. I just kind of got lucky there. So when it comes to color, I think it's a lot of what you like, and maybe there's something that fits with your branding or your content or your topic or whatever, but I don't have any advice really as far as color goes. Something that you like, that you think looks good on camera if you wanted to paint a wall. What I will recommend, and the thing that I see so many people make mistakes with, is the sheen of their wall. So a lot of people will get a gloss or a semi-gloss paint, which is terrible because it just turns the wall into a shiny surface, and you're starting to see light reflections, and it all looks kind of like wet and greasy all the time. You want as flat of a color as possible. So whatever color you choose, when you're getting that paint and they ask what finish to get a flat finish. I would say just flat. Sometimes like an eggshell is kind of flat. Just get a flat finish. That way the color's going to be there, but it's not going to reflect. It's not going to be like shiny and have these hot spots because of your lighting. And I don't know, glossy wall paint on camera always looks really weird to me. And that's the biggest thing I would look out. Pierre Drawn says, how to hang everything on the ceiling to no longer have feet on the floor. Yes. If you have a studio and you have a set that you like and everything is kind of set in place, especially if you're limited on space, something to consider is getting stuff off of the floor. There are a couple ways to do this. A lot of mounts you can just mount to the ceiling. And if you go to a website like B&H and you start looking up things like baby plates and similar accessories, which are essentially lighting brackets that you can just screw into a wall or a ceiling, and then you can attach a light there. That's how I have my hair light mounted. I've used them for all kinds of things over the years. They are amazing. The only thing to be aware of if you're doing that, especially on any wall, but especially a ceiling, is to make sure that you're mounting them into a stud, or you're using the appropriate anchors to give you the support, because you don't want to hang a very heavy light above someone in a ceiling, not secure it, and then it falls. You can also, which I would recommend doing, and I did in all the studios that I set up, and on my hair light in this studio, is you can get a little metal, it's like a metal wire, and then separately from the light, you can mount like like a hook, not a hook, but it's like a circle with a screw on it. I can't think of what any of these things are called, but you can mount something like that separately. Or in the case of my studios, we had not the beams, but the grid in the ceiling with pipes. So you could just string that to one of the pipes, string that around the light, and then it's a safety precaution. So in case the light does come off the main mount, it won't fall. It'll swing, and this metal, this metal connector thing will stop it from falling down. So that's very important to keep in mind. There are all kinds of crazy wall mounts. If you're not, ceiling's tricky because gravity's constantly pulling down on the thing, but if you're mounting on the wall, then you have a lot more options. There's all kinds of articulating arms and light mounts and light stands that you can mount into the wall. Even some of the really inexpensive, like newer and impact ones, can be great because they're just big hunks of metal. Again, same thing though, just make sure you're mounting them appropriately. And if you can't mount stuff, you're in a place where you're renting, maybe you don't want to put a bunch of holes in the wall, definitely go to a channel like Caleb Pike's DSLR Video Shooter, where he has so many videos about like one stand setups. So you still have a stand, but there are tons of ways where you can get one stand that has like your camera, your light, your microphone, everything mounted to this one stand instead of a bunch of different stands. And that's a cool thing to do. Stephen Martin, photography. Hey, Steve, how do you choose what height to place your camera? Eye level? I would choose, honestly, like ultimately, if we're talking YouTube, whatever works best. If you want best practices, whatever you like, I guess. But if you want best practices, I would say, at least what I tend to do is eye level or a little below. But some people say eye level or a little above. And it's kind of just what works. Eye level's great because especially if you think of something like YouTube, if you're doing anything like the kind of videos I do, I like to feel like I'm talking to the person. And if we were sitting in the room talking, we would be basically at eye level and having a conversation. If the camera's too low, it's going to make me look big and like imposing. If the camera's too high, it's going to make me look small and meek. And nobody really wants to take advice from someone who feels like they're big and imposing on them. And maybe people wouldn't trust someone who looks like they're small and meek. So many people just mount a webcam on top of their computer monitor, or they bump up their camera on a tripod to peek over their computer monitor. And then it's this weird like high angle and the person just looks, it's almost like you reached a camera over a cubicle wall and like caught someone doing something. I don't like that. So eye level is a good place to start, and maybe a little lower or a little higher, sort of depending on your tastes. Something I've noticed, which is really funny, is whenever I meet, not whenever, but so many times when I've met someone from YouTube in person, they have been so much taller than I expected. And so many times when I've met like a movie star or a TV star in person, they are so much shorter than I expected. And I realize it's because, Hollywood, which doesn't mean just the location, but the industry. Movie stars want to look big and tall and powerful. And so cameras are often low. Sets are often built slightly smaller than real life. Whereas on YouTube, people are using kind of just regular stuff, like regular size furniture in a regular size space. And they just put the camera at eye level, or maybe they even put it up a little too high. And so instead of trying to create artificial height and size like Hollywood does in YouTube, like the opposite almost happens by accident. And then you meet people in real life and they're so much like taller than you would expect. It's happened so many times. It's crazy. Steve also asks, what's too much stuff to have in the background? Is a plain wall boring? We talked about the plain wall thing being effective. The too much stuff, I mean, I have a whole bunch of stuff like I talked about in the background. I like that. I mean, it's all what works for you. I would say as long as it's not distracting in a negative way, like a giant sign that says donkey balls is distracting probably. But if it's stuff that, shows your personality, explores the topic that you're talking about, I think the thing that drew me to Casey Neistat, like back when Casey's was daily vlogging and his videos were being like constantly on the front page of YouTube, I avoided them because I just knew that my high school students liked him, and the other YouTubers that my high school students liked were not channels that I wanted to watch. Pretty much is a lot of like crazy prank channels. And I was like, this guy, he's just constantly on my homepage. And so finally I clicked on a video. I don't remember what video it was, but it's one where he's in his New York studio. He's talking to the camera. And of course the video was interesting. And like the topic, I was like, this is not at all. This guy's like 36. This is not at all what I expected. I thought it was some, 19-year-old screaming, doing pranks or something. But in addition to the topic being interesting, his studio like really caught my attention. And if you've seen Casey's studio, it's an organized place, but there's stuff everywhere. It is not like a minimalist place at all. And I remember what I really liked about it was it felt like a place where when the camera wasn't on, I could imagine him being in there and doing stuff, like making things, working on stuff. It didn't seem totally like a set. It seemed like a practical space that he was also making videos in. And I loved that. And when it came time that I started making my own YouTube videos, instead of building, a pristine set that would never be touched, I wanted to film it in a space where I was already working and doing stuff. And it, I loved having the drums in the background for a long time, even though they took up a lot of space. But it was cool because it's like, yeah, you probably don't see me play these on camera a lot, but I play them almost every day. Like they are getting used all the time. And it just felt fun to bring people into a space that I use a lot. Hey, JFlow asks, filming at 35 millimeters, how far should the camera be? How much headspace do I need? There's no set rule here. Again, it's what looks right to you. 35 millimeters, I'm not sure if you're doing full frame or crop sensor, but generally It kind of depends. I have found if you're doing, I'm assuming we'll say a YouTube talking head video or a stream or something, a medium shot where it's kind of like starting in mid chest and going to just above your head feels a little too tight for me. And a lot of people, when they put a 35 millimeter lens in a standard room, that's kind of the shot they end up with. So maybe being able to widen the shot or back away from the camera a bit to show more than a medium shot would be good. For me, I talk with my hands a lot, so I need a wider frame so that my hands aren't always getting cut off and going out of frame. I like having a table in the shot most of the time because I'm often talking about something that I want to be able to set down and show, and even just putting my arms on the table, I like that. So that kind of goes wider. So that sort of depends. Like, I feel like a medium shot and a close-up is a little too close for like long-form YouTube videos. It almost feels uncomfortable if that's all you see. Sometimes you might want to crop into that and then crop back out. I like a little bit wider. Mainly, I just keep in mind personally, like, not what I want to show of the background, but how I talk with my hands, and are my hands going to get cut off? And then headspace, I usually personally just leave a little bit of space above the top of my hair. It might be different for everybody, but I don't want to cut off the top of my head for many reasons, mainly staying alive. But I don't want to cut off the top of my hair or head, and I don't want to have too much space. I don't want there to be so much space above me that it's like you're almost expecting a graphic or something to be up there because it's so wide. So just, nice, relatively tight headspace is good. Jason Papa V asks, sound treatment. We didn't really talk about that because I have that in my notes here. Sound treatment, I think, is its own topic that could be its own episode. Maybe it should be its own episode. I will say paying attention to sound treatment obviously is important. There are a bunch of ways to cover that, depending on the elements that you include in your set and where you're filming, like if the room is carpeted or not, if you have a bunch of stuff, if you just have a wall. The stuff in your set and the set itself could potentially help with sound treatment or cause problems with sound treatment too. It is definitely something important to consider. I think the ways to approach it are, I know with lights, there's like practical and, a practical light is a light that you see on set that's emitting light. And then there are lights you don't see on set. I don't know if there's a term like that for sound treatment. 'Cause sometimes sound treatment, you see people with like panels in the background, and some stuff can get really designy and cool. And that way your sound treatment is there. It's making things sound better, but it's also creating a cool look in your studio. And other times the sound treatment is something you never see, but is always there. Either way is totally fine. I don't currently have any sound treatment visible in my main shot, although I did for a while, and both are fine. I think focusing on sound treatment is important. Focusing on flat, wide surfaces like desks, walls, you're going to get a lot of reflections, and being able to block those out. Figuring out where you're at and where most of your sound is emitting from. If you're the one talking, that's the kind of video you're making. I have a big sound panel directly in front of me that I talk into, or I don't talk into it, but I'm talking towards it, so that absorbs some of the reflections so they don't bounce back. And then I also have one kind of above me, because what was happening is there's a wall several feet in front of me, and I found that the reflection of my voice was hitting that and then kind of bouncing up on the ceiling and creating like this reverb. And so by just putting panels in those two places, I ended up really changing the sound of the room. I didn't have to make the whole place look like a mental institution by having padded walls everywhere. Joshi989 asks, Elgato key lights ×2 left and right side of the desk versus one big nano light. I haven't used the key lights myself. I do like their small profile, and I know people love them. The thing I have noticed when people have the two Elgato lights on the desk pointed at them is they're a little bit harsh. They are kind of diffuse. They do have like a built-in diffuser thing, but as soon as you get them bright enough where you kind of want them, they start feeling a little harsh. They're just, there's a big difference even with a sort of opaque diffuse surface that a light's shining through versus a soft box in terms of how soft the light is actually getting. So if I had to choose, I would choose a light in a soft box. I mean, that's what I did choose. That's what I'm using, because that's what I like. But if you're using the Elgato lights, I think they might, I could be wrong. I think they might make small little soft boxes that go on them, and that can make a big difference. If your setup is against a wall, just turning those lights around and having them bounce off the wall or angle them up a little bit so they bounce off the wall on the ceiling can really help take out some of the harshness. So I would go for one big light in a softbox. It doesn't have to be a big, like I use I use the Nan Light Forza 200 as my key light, but it goes into a Light Dome Mini. So it doesn't go into like a giant, huge softbox, but that Light Dome Mini is enough to diffuse things pretty well in a pretty good way. Labeled and Known says, how far should you be distance-wise from the camera? The answer is as far as you need to be. So it's going to depend on your camera, your space, the lens that you're using, all that kind of stuff. Again, there's no right or wrong. If you like it, it works. Focal length of a lens does change the way someone looks. A wide angle lens really close to you is going to make you look very different than a long lens far away. The thing I will say is if you need to have your camera far away, running some kind of monitor from your camera to be a little closer to you, or running your camera into your computer so you can monitor it, becomes really important, because when the camera is a little too far away, even if it has a flip out screen, it can be hard to tell if it's recording, if you are in focus, what the autofocus is connected to. So distance-wise, there's no right or wrong. It's whatever needs to be for the situation. Just make sure you're able, especially if the camera's far away, to monitor everything. Pat Babam asks, what's the optimum placement for a disco ball on set? My question is, why would there only be one? You should have 12 or 13 minimum, and they should just be everywhere all the time. Papa D Toxic has part 1 and part 2. Part 1 says, I'm doing 3 different streams at work with 3 people this spring. I have 3 cameras for the streams, and I use Ecamm Live. Where should I point the cameras? So you're talking about multicam stuff. A good thing to keep in mind here is the 180-degree rule, which for this kind of set stuff sort of ends up being followed by accident a lot of the time. If you're unfamiliar what that means, I used to do a project with my students where I would force them to break this rule a lot. But imagine you have 2 people sitting at a table and they're facing each other, and the camera's at the end of the table. So the camera is seeing the side, the left side of one person and the right side of the other, and they're facing each other. And that camera that's filming both of them, we'll call that camera 1, your main camera. That's getting your master shot. Then you have 2 other cameras on either side of that. One is kind of going over the shoulder of one person to get the face of the other. The other is going over the shoulder of the other person. So you have camera 2 and camera 3. So you have a main shot, and then you have an over the shoulder or a close-up of the other 2 people. That, the cameras are all kind of on that one side there. That's going to make sense. When you cut to those things, in terms of like, I don't know if not geographic, but location of the people in the space, a viewer is going to feel like, yes, this person is on the left, this person is on the right. That makes sense. If, however, you had your main camera filming them, where we had it, but instead of having the other cameras just off to the side, you sort of put them on the other side, like opposite the other end of the table, so that instead of, your main camera is filming the left side of someone's face, but now you put the B camera at the other end, so now it's filming the right side of that person. Essentially, you've now gone more than 180 degrees around. You've got 360 degrees to the other side of that table. And now what's going to happen is when you cut to those shots, it's going to look like the people switched sides. Or you're going to end up with dialogue scenes, if you're cutting back and forth, where like one person is pointing toward, is facing the right side of the screen talking to someone, and then you cut to the person they're talking to, and they are also facing the right side of the screen, and it looks like people are having a conversation facing like away from each other, kind of. That's essentially like the 180-degree rule. That was probably a little more convoluted of an explanation. Essentially, though, if you think of a talk show set, right? Think of, regardless of whether you like them or not, think of like the Tonight Show or something. They have usually a desk and a couch, and the cameras are sort of in front of those things. The cameras aren't going behind them. Usually they're not going like on the sides or anything. They're not breaking that 180-degree rule. So if you're doing your streams and you've got people with 3 cameras, you probably want one camera to be a wide shot that's sort of the whole set with all the people. And then the other 2 cameras, probably one on each side of that camera, are getting individual shots and close-ups, or maybe like a dual shot, 2 people here, 1 person in the other camera, something like that. That's what I would do, or at least that's where I would start. Let's see. And actually, those are all of our questions. Cool. So a few last things to consider before we wrap up this discussion. Once you've built a set, don't be afraid to evolve it and let it change. I think it's easy to sometimes feel like I put so much work in this, I'm going to leave it set in stone. Don't feel like you can't. You can always change things. You can always evolve it. I have had a tradition personally of like every April for the past few years, I've done a studio tour video. I'm planning to do one in just a few weeks because it's almost April again. And I feel like I have my home studio set just how I like it. And I don't want to change anything. But almost like clockwork, as soon as I make the studio tour video, like within days, I make some big change. And by the time the video comes out, it's like, oh no, it's not even like that anymore. And that's just a thing that happens, you know. I know for me, what I do is I set something up, whether it's my own personal thing or any of the other, like, you know, sets that I've designed over the years. And it works and I like it. And then you start to see friction maybe pop up, or especially for most of us, space is really limited. And you start to notice like, wow, there's so much space in this corner that's not being utilized. What could we do with that? What could we change? And, you know, I always think sets are kind of, even if the viewer doesn't necessarily notice all the differences, they're always kind of evolving to make it easier to get a better quality end product. But at the same time, while not being afraid to let things evolve, don't feel obligated to change what's working. Just because, you know, if you have a perfect set that you love and it works for you, don't feel like, oh, I've been using this for a year and a half and it hasn't changed at all. I have to redo my lighting. I have to rearrange everything. Like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And don't feel an obligation to change something that's actually working. And then I did have a note about sound treatment. It will play into your set design, whether it's visible on camera or not. I appreciate everyone who sent in questions. Appreciate you listening. I hope there were some, you know, little nuggets of info that you could take away from this. If you have anything you'd like to add, feel free to reach out anytime. Tom@enthusiasmproject.com via email, or you can just go to hi-my-name-is-tom.com and quickly record a message. Very easily. I shouldn't say quickly. Take as much time as you want, but you can easily record a message. And then I hope you have a safe, happy, and healthy rest of your week, and I will see you next time.